All right, everybody. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Katie Green. I lead marketing at Current Health, and I'm going to kick us off today. Today's session is focused on evolving standard of care for the next wave of immunotherapeutics. We're joined by some excellent clinical experts today. A couple of high-level housekeeping things. Yes, we are recording this session, and we will send that to you afterward in case you'd like to share it with a colleague. We also are planning to save a few minutes at the end for some Q&A. So use that Q&A box to send us the questions that you have kind of as we go through the session, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. Quick plug that we are really looking forward to the ASH conference coming up. So if you are going to be there, please come by and say hi. We will be hanging out at booth 158. And shout out there to a poster session that we've collaborated on and that Dr. Rajeev is presenting. That's poster 2751 in session 906. The focus of that is looking at the effectiveness of remote patient monitoring in enabling outpatient step-up dosing for bispecifics. So we won't give away the plot on today's session, but we will talk a little bit about some of the research that we've collaborated on. All right, let's get rolling. Pleased to introduce you today to our three speakers. Our moderator is Dr. Matt Wilkes. He's the Chief Medical Officer for Current Health. And Matt is joined by Dr. Sridevi Rajeeve and Dr. Neha Korde, both physician researchers and hematologist oncologists at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So we've got a lot to get through today. We're going to talk about kind of the changing therapeutic landscape, look at the models that MSK has been using and what that support looks like. We'll talk about some of the research and their work to advance the standard of care and kind of what they're navigating and encountering within MSK. And then we'll zoom out and look at the future outlook and how that physician education and change management is going so far. So with that, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of catch up some new people with what Current Health does.
Thank you, Katie. Welcome, everyone. To those of you who came to our last webinar, welcome back. I like that we're now building up a series and a following. So for those of you new to Current Health, we are a company that grew out of Scotland, now long based in Boston, and we exist to facilitate complex care in the home. And for a long time, that was around the hospital at home space. We still do that, but for the last probably 3-4 years, we've been focusing more and more, and now pretty much exclusively, on novel therapeutics. We pride ourselves as being the leading partner for complex and acute care at home, but we also do a lot of research, both with our partners, such as Neha and Sri, who are with me this evening, and this morning in the US, this evening in the UK. And for that, we've both built up our own data and worked with our partners' data to publish on clinical, operation, and financial results. Next slide. Thanks, Katie. So very briefly on what we offer. We grew out of being a remote patient monitoring company, but we still provide that as the kind of backbone of our offering. So patients go home with a suite of monitoring kit that works together to capture the full range of vital signs that are required to keep these kind of complex patients safe at home. We have a nursing triage service that can take these vital signs and turn them into useful actions for our clinician partners. And we wrap services around that in terms of end-to-end logistics management, technical support. We're always keen to develop our product to be better for this space. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be joined by Dr. Korde and Dr. Rajeeve, because they've both been instrumental in helping us tailor what we offer for this particular space. So that's the plug done. Welcome on making it through. Thank you. Let's get stuck into what you're all here for. So I'd love to start with both of our speakers. To start with you, Neha, if you'd love to introduce yourself to the audience, that would be great. Thank you.
Yep. Hi, everybody. And it's such a pleasure to be here. My name is Dr. Neha Korde. I am on the myeloma service at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I serve as the clinical director for our service.
Thanks, Neha. And Sri.
Hi, everyone. Again, happy to be back at the second webinar with Current Health and discussing some of the projects that we've been doing. My name is Sridevi Rajeeve. I'm also in the multiple myeloma service at Sloan Kettering and also in the cell therapy service with an interest in novel therapeutics. So we're looking forward to discussing what we've been doing and what the future may look like.
Thanks, Sri. I wonder how many of these things you have to do to become influencers, celebrities at that stage. So I'd love to start, I suppose, just by briefly setting the stage for this webinar, which is that we've all kind of collectively witnessed a shift from traditional inpatient care for cancers with simple chemotherapies to complex cellular and gene therapies that are now beginning to be delivered as outpatient services. And this new and expanding class of immunotherapeutics, CAR-Ts, bispecifics, checkpoint inhibitors, etc., present these kind of wonderful opportunities for patient care, but kind of traditionally have tied patients to the hospital because of the concerns about their side effects, cytokine release syndrome, ICANS, and others. And so what we have to do as we move these treatments to outpatients is balance these things that have shown to be efficacious in trials with their true effectiveness in outpatient practice. Can we do it safely? Can we make sure there's a good patient and provider experience? Can we manage the logistics? And so we end up with this position where care is moving really fast and sometimes faster than systems can adapt. And so kind of the theme of today's webinar really is how do we safely keep pace with all of these changes? And I think your program at MSKCC does that better than most. So I'd love it if, Sri, we just started with you and you could just describe the MSKCC model for immunotherapeutics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we talk about immunotherapeutics, I'm going to restrict myself to the field we're in, which is multiple myeloma. And, specifically to the project that Neha and I are partnering with Current Health is in the form of bispecific antibodies. Now, I do want to acknowledge that MSK has a working system for outpatient CAR-T that is, something that has been spearheaded by the cellular therapy service of MSK, and it involves a lot of different services and different nurses and nurse practitioners that have been trained exclusively for outpatient handling of these patients. And we have a set workflow for these patients, including outpatient administration and exclusive outpatient follow-up of these patients as long as they remain complication-free. But that, again, is a different form of discussion because CAR-T, again, is a different animal. But coming back to what we implemented in our home service, which is multiple myeloma service, that's specifically regarding bispecific antibodies. Now, bispecific antibodies are a form of immunotherapeutics that have really changed, similar to CAR-T, the landscape of multiple myeloma in the sense that we now have these really efficacious therapies. But the US label for these drugs, especially the first-in-class drugs like teclistamab, talquetamab, followed by elranatamab, these drugs, the clinical trials were designed in such a way that they were designed with a step-up dosing so that you do not hit the treatment dose right off the bat, because we realize that there are some cytokine release syndrome and neurotoxicity like toxicities that are accompanying these bispecific antibodies, which can put patients in the hospital for a prolonged time. Therefore, these drugs are typically given in a step-up dosing, and that step-up dosing is usually patients are in the hospital. What we quickly realized as we started giving these patients in both clinical trials as well as in the commercial setting is that these patients are quickly filling up hospital beds. And with that, they're just waiting for their cytokine release syndrome to happen. And oftentimes with bispecific antibodies, unlike CAR T cell therapies, their degree of toxicities are slightly lesser, while the incidence or the frequency with which they happen is very similar, but the grade of toxicity is slightly lesser than that of CAR T. So that triggered the question, why can't we maybe try to move these patients to the outpatient service while having a layer of monitoring so that we can bring them in as needed? So that, again, led as a natural consequence to looking at how can we effectively monitor these patients. Now, the two ways of doing it is with or without continuous remote patient monitoring. Without remote patient monitoring would include a lot of personnel. It would include having to develop a system and relying on at the moment, additional burden on our nursing service to really follow these. So what Dr. Korde and the rest of the service decided to explore, and really spearheaded by Dr. Korde at MSK, was to really try to find a platform where these patients can be monitored and independent of MSK, but with MSK oversight, so that we can essentially keep these patients in the outpatient setting and yet administer these bispecific antibodies to them. So the workflow that we came up was that a patient who is now the primary treating oncologist decides to give bispecific antibody, as long as they have a caregiver, and that is kind of mandatory. They need to have a caregiver who is able to be educated, willing to be educated, and escalate as necessary, and they should be continuous. It doesn't need to be the same caregiver, but it needs to be continuous. As long as they're living at least 1.5 or 90 hours or 90 minutes away from the main MSK center. And we did that leeway because, again, in where we are situated in New York City, 90 minutes can still be 4 miles. So we just decided to be a little bit more liberal in terms of time. We didn't want to mandate, okay, only patients who live half an hour with an MSK. No, we wanted to expand that, and we have successfully pulled off that. So patients who are able to get to the main center within an hour and a half of an alert that is received, as well as patients who are of relatively good performance status, meaning they're able to take care of a lot of their activities of daily living by themselves. The patients who we did not conceive were a good fit for this program were people who came in with a high disease burden and people who were not of a good performance status, and those who had prior or present neurologic symptoms or any concern of myeloma being in the central nervous system, because again, all of these risk factors were putting these patients into a higher risk of a higher frequency and higher grade of toxicities like cytokine release syndrome and neurotoxicity. So we have the way this program was designed, we are giving these bispecific antibodies all the step-up doses of these drugs as outpatient, followed by a telemedicine visit on the next day to check in. And all this time, the patient is wearing the continuous the wearable device that's capturing vital signs continuously and displayed on the Current Health platform, which from the MSK side, we do check in multiple times a day, but then we have and we rely on the CCC, that is a clinical command center from Current Health, whose nurses are monitoring 24/7. We also huddle with the CCC every day on a weekday at 4:30. This is to check in on all the patients who are on this platform to make sure that there are anything that from our end we could help or any alerts that have or have not been addressed, etc. Should a patient have a toxicity, for example, they spike a fever or have a CAR-T, we have two mechanisms in place. Every patient, before they start treatment, goes home with 10 milligrams of dexamethasone that they're keeping with them. They do not take it. But when or should they have fever, we advise them to take the dexamethasone and then present to the ER. And in the ER, we partner with our ER to have a workflow in which they will be admitted to the observation unit, not necessarily the main admission to the main floor. And they will be observed. They will be administered tocilizumab, which is a drug that's specific to target or mitigate the effects of cytokine release syndrome. And they are released in 24 to 72 hours, depending on when their fever comes down. And if all goes well, they go back to the outpatient next step-up dose. Dr. Korde, were there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think you've perfectly described it, actually. I think one of the things that you're describing is that it sounds so simple now, but it actually took a lot in terms of organizing this complex level of care. And whether it be partnering with our ER physicians, setting up algorithms from the outpatient side to the inpatient side. But essentially, the idea and the goal of the model is to move what we thought was, relatively low risk patients that were receiving bispecific antibodies to the outpatient center, because, essentially that level of higher care was really not needed on the inpatient side.
Thank you both. I mean, that's very well explained in terms of its clarity, but also definitely alludes to the complexity of what you've set up. I guess, as you pointed out, these programs don't really exist in a vacuum. You have to get physicians on side on your own service and allied services, in ED, everything else. Neha, to sort of build on what you said, how does this model that you guys have put together kind of change the expectations of your physicians? How do you bring clinicians along with you who aren't natural early adopters or see this or have safety worries or worries about their own workflows or implications for their work?
Yes. So MSK, like any other healthcare institution, is a very big, vast of different departments all working together in parallel, and they all have their own workflows. When we started out to design this program, it was really important for us to go ahead and coordinate with each of the stakeholders, specifically with the nurses, the pharmacists. We had to come up with an algorithm. I alluded to this earlier with the ER. Specifically at MSK, to make sure that should a patient arrive and present to the ED, they know exactly what to do. Which patients would, need to be admitted to the inpatient side, or which patients can we just continue to observe in the ER under observation for a short period of time and then subsequently be discharged for their next step-up dose. So we had to create all of that and start from scratch and understanding what works for our institution, and realize that that might not work for other institutions. So by setting up this model, we had to literally go from department to department, clear everything, and make sure that everybody was on board with the plan, create these algorithmic workflows. And then, since the program launched, we also had to go back and then retrain because, of course, staffing turnover and everything like that. So doing these check-ins with these different departments is important. And also understanding sometimes the algorithm needs to be tweaked, changed. Maybe there's some new data that occurs or some signal or some occurrence that happens that, didn't necessarily work the first time, and be open to changing those workflows. So it does take a lot, not just even set up in the beginning, but also to check back in with these different departments. And then there's a whole side of it of talking to the patients and their caregivers and understanding that they have all the expectations of what's supposed to happen. So again, a lot of the burden is now then placed back on the patient and the caregiver, and to a degree, the current health system is alleviating some of that stress because we have the CCC checking in with our patients, but to make sure that the patients and their caregivers understand, okay, what happens if you have a fever? That's another level of education that we had to make sure that they are aware of.
That makes total sense. So I guess one of the things that I hadn't really appreciated, because I've come from a critical care background and a kind of armchair oncologist that I've over the last few years, is the degree of education that is required, both within the service and for other patients. And having chatted to some hematologists who don't work at academic medical centres, some of them, again, find the pace of therapeutics that are coming out quite difficult to keep on top of, particularly if they're not an oncological person, if they're a platelet person or something else. This is a whole big thing for them. I guess, Sri, when delivering that education, was there particular themes that were important or that were really high value to get across? Or was it, as Neha said, more about understanding the flow and the protocols and what happens if someone spikes a fever? Or were there kind of particular other areas that you had to concentrate on to get everyone on side?
Right. So I think, again, after the initial few patients, we continually happen to learn what works and what doesn't work. So with respect to education for patients and their caregivers, I think what really helps is having, initially we tried to have the education built into one single clinical visit, but then we quickly realized that repetitions and reiterations are much more useful. And so again, patient education, we ask them to bring the caregiver that will be the primary caregiver during that monitoring period along with them so that device education can be provided. We have them sign an attestation form that they understood so that, we are also having them repeat what they understood with regards to when to wear the device, how to wear the device, when to charge, how to charge. All of these are what we consider mundane things, but so important when we actually have a patient monitoring. For example, for someone who is like, oh, I left my device for charging, I didn't realize how long it takes or how long it doesn't take to charge, and then us missing out on a huge chunk of the monitoring time, again, which all could have been just avoided had we asked the patient, did you understand when to charge and when not to charge, etc. So a lot of these minor details, whether you can put it on when you go for your treatment to the clinic, can you put it on when you're taking a shower, for example. So a lot of these small questions, as well as the overall purpose of why we are doing it, how we are monitoring, caregiver buy-in, as well as, the buy-in from our colleagues, right? Between Neha and I, we can put patients on such a pilot, but really, we are very close to completion of the study, and that has been due to the concerted efforts of patients being referred to this program by our colleagues itself. So a lot goes in. It is time consuming, but also rewarding when we are finally there.
Not to tease your ASH paper, but what have been some of the rewards? What have been some of the things you found during this first trial of this service?
Absolutely. So we were, so again, I invite the attendees who are in this webinar to really go ahead and check out our abstract that we submitted for the American Society of Hematology conference, which should now be live, and this will be presented in December at the ASH meeting as well. For the ASH meeting, we took a quick look at 18 patients in this pilot program who received bispecific antibodies as an outpatient. So for these 18 patients, Matt, what we really found out was that the vast majority of them, like almost 89% of them, were able to complete the outpatient step-up dosing. What happened to the others? Well, there were complications, as will happen in the real world. Some of them had medical complications in the sense that, some of them had fevers and then had to be admitted. Some of them had a kidney dysfunction that needed to be addressed, so they were admitted to the hospital, and the remainder of the doses were given in the hospital. We also had an instance of when a patient was unable to complete outpatient doses due to a compliance issue or an adherence issue. So a complex mix of reasons, but again, a minority of these patients only had an issue where the full completion of step-up doses did not happen outpatient. But it's very, very encouraging that, we started off with this, and taking a quick look, the real world percentage of having been able to take almost 89% of these patients to outpatient is, it's a success. All of these were patients who otherwise would have been admitted to the inpatient and would have just been in the hospital for anywhere between 7 to 10 days. So that's one of the biggest takeaways. We were able to keep almost 89 to 90% of these patients in the outpatient setting. There were no real missed events per se. The wearable device and the remote patient monitoring was able to capture fever, which is heralding the onset of cytokine release syndrome, very accurately. And all these patients were escalated appropriately within our pathway and were brought in to the urgent care or emergency room of MSK and treated appropriately. Therefore, escalation of care also happened in the way we envisioned. Of course, there were hiccups along the way. We learned, for example, patients, despite being instructed to come immediately, they wait till, if it's in the early hours of the morning, they're like, okay, we'll come in at 6 o'clock instead of 3 a.m. Again, we can only lead the horse to the water. We can't make it drink, essentially. But again, that's when, when the patients, there is a delay from the patient side, is when, again, continuous monitoring is so useful to make sure that these patients are not deteriorating. And then again, there are a couple of patients who did forget to take the dexamethasone when they presented to the ER. So these are all lessons learned along the way, but 100% of these patients had the appropriate escalation of care. And interestingly, once we started the pilot, there was a change in NCCN guidelines in when we could incorporate tocilizumab to mitigate some of these side effects. So even in this cohort, the first few patients, around 8 patients, went ahead with step-up dosing, having not received any sort of medication or tocilizumab to mitigate any fevers. And 100% of them, 8 out of 8 of these patients ended up having fevers, which is cytokine release syndrome. They were escalated and they were treated. Once the guidelines changed, Dr. Korde and I worked with the team, and we incorporated prophylactic tocilizumab, meaning, when we give the first step-up dosing, we also gave tocilizumab in an effort to just dampen the whole cytokine storm that stimulates this fever. And what we saw was that every single patient who received tocilizumab did not mount a fever, and they had a much more smoother sailing along the course of receiving outpatient bispecifics as well. So that really was interesting to see the differences in how, a real-time incorporation when guidelines change can also enhance this model.
Again, very well explained, Sri, and it kind of, I sometimes have to remind myself that these patients, this is fifth line treatment in many cases, the amount of things that these people have been through to get to this stage. So being able to keep that many out of the hospital, which I'm sure they are thoroughly sick of, is, a wonderful achievement. You picked up on some interesting themes there. Like the first was the value of continuous data, which I think it's safe to say is debated in this space. Some people would say no monitoring, some people would say intermittent patient-led monitoring, some continuous monitoring. Even though I work for a company that has a continuous monitoring product, I'm fairly agnostic, but I'm open to, I think, what you were both saying, which is that the being able to keep an eye on the patients when they have other things going on, being compliant, not being compliant, being able to do things overnight, being able to have pre-warning of some of these things so you can plan the treatments does seem to make a lot of sense. More broadly, Neha, it'd be lovely to hear about some more of the research work that you're both doing. We've alluded to this ASH abstract, but you both do a lot in this space. So is there anything else you'd like to highlight at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a couple of, beyond just the program that Shri just mentioned, we have a couple of interesting um, research projects coming down the pipeline of looking at same CRS using these remote patient monitoring devices, and also understanding how it changes from therapy to therapy. So whether it be CAR T cells given in actually even in AL amyloidosis patients. We have a wonderful project going on with Dr. Landau. And, that's interesting because those patients also have propensity for having different cardiac toxicities and things like that. And then, we also have a wonderful project coming down the line, similarly, looking at CRS profiles using remote patient monitors or the wearable devices to capture patients that are receiving a BCMA bispecific in conjunction with a cereblon modulator. And there's some thought process that cereblon modulator is going to go ahead and activate or prime up the T cells. And so one of the things that the remote patient monitoring devices are doing is trying to understand, what that CRS signal looks like with a combination therapy using a bispecific, specifically with the cereblon modulator that's geared towards priming these T cells. Does that give you more of a CRS frequency? Does that give you less of one? How strong is that signal? And because we're monitoring these patients continuously, the goal and the thought process is, hopefully those devices are going to kind of be able to differentiate between the different signals and how that compares from platform to platform. So that I think is super, super interesting and a very kind of really neat thing that we're doing across these different therapeutic platforms. Because we're not just talking about bispecifics, we're talking about CAR T cells, we're talking about combos with bispecifics. What does that look like? How does the CRS profiling and ICANS profiling change when you look at this across the spectrum?
That's wonderful. And I think one of the things that I've been very conscious of through working here is that the value of free living data, of catching people when they're at home, when they're going about their activities of daily living, what becomes of them overnight, all of these things. And there I can really see the value of continuous data gathering. I mean, actually, that was the first time that we started working together, Sri, was the work we did when you were at Mount Sinai. Would you just like to outline that for 2 minutes for Neha's point? Because actually it kind of kicked off a lot of these things and I suppose illustrates some of the point that Neha was making.
Sure. So, I think the work that we did previously at Mount Sinai was really trying to see how It was basically a feasibility study, trying to see if wearable devices can effectively capture cytokine release syndrome that is triggered by CAR T cell therapy. So, that was essentially not done in the outpatient setting because it was a feasibility study. It was done in the inpatient setting. And we were, just to make things simple, we were trying to look for concordance. When nurses detect cytokine release syndrome, is that captured effectively and at the same time by the wearable device as well? So in a 30 patient cohort, what we found was that the wearable device, when capturing data in a remote patient monitoring system, not only captured any instance of fever in 100% of all patients. There were no missed events. But, after we did some modeling and some calculations and real-time comparisons to when fever was captured by nurses, we saw that there was actually a lead time in when the initial fever or the trend towards fever was picked up by wearable devices. And that roughly came around to around 4.5 to 5 hours. The project also combined some blood work to really look for the elicitation of cytokines. And when combined with wearable devices and some early capture of cytokines in the blood, we could actually predict up to 5.5 to 6 hours prior to the actual clinical onset of fever that a fever was about to happen. So that really was such an interesting study. It's, hopefully will be published very soon. We're just going through some additional data workup right now, but that's such a good data set to really understand how wearable devices alone or in combination with the addition of some blood tests and some modeling can really predict, also have not just detecting capability, but also have predicting capability in when cytokine release syndrome is happening. And therefore, all this boils down to how early can we pick up fever and other signs, and how quickly can we warn patients, and how quickly can we move them along the escalation pathway.
Thanks, Sri, and that's really helpful. And I guess it comes back to what you both outlined at the beginning about the complexity of the program. And so if you do have that pre-warning, then hopefully, and you now, as you've established, are able to give tocilizumab at an earlier point, that you might then be able to do this in more of a planned way. So you're not relying on the patient either taking their polydexamethasone or getting themselves the 4 miles across town at rush hour. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So I guess if we take stock of where we've got to, with about 15 minutes left, is we've seen through your work that it's possible to have the right patients at home, not in the hospital, receiving their treatment somewhat more on their own terms and also away from the dangers of the hospital. However, there are more and more treatments coming through. So Neha, as we think about these treatments moving into earlier lines of therapies, on a kind of organizational level, really, how do you anticipate that affecting access to care, the standards of care? How do you take what you and Sri have done and cope with the coming tide?
Yeah. So currently, if we think about where the bispecifics are, just even in the myeloma landscape, they're really right now approved for patients that are more relapse refractory. So what that boils down to is patients need multiple lines of therapy before we can even order them as standard of care. And so that narrows down the pool currently at the moment. However, if we look at sort of what's coming down the pipeline, essentially these bispecific therapies, including even CAR T cells, they're being moved into earlier lines of therapy, which means that we are now going to be able to give them earlier, and therefore more and more patients will then be essentially able to receive them. This creates basically a numbers problem and a bed crunch issue. So if we think about hospital care systems and how many beds that they have available at any given time, if you're saying, essentially that, more patients are able to receive this therapy, and we know that that's the right answer because apparently, the data is then going to essentially show that they're more efficacious compared to the standard of care therapy. So the answer should not be, okay, we know that it's more efficacious, but we shouldn't be able to give it to them because we don't have the hospital beds to give it to them. So that's the wrong answer. The right answer is we need to come up with a system where we can essentially move them out to the outpatient, world, and how we can administer them safely. And so, we're not going to necessarily be able to admit everybody to the inpatient side. So how do we find the correct patients? Who are these correct patients? How do we open up access to care? And, by working through this project, we start to realize that the more earlier lines of therapy that these drugs are being given, we will need to address this issue head on, face on in the future, whether we like it or not, because we need to make these, we need to make it available to these patients to be able to give to them.
That makes complete sense. And I think how do you see these things? Because I know you have satellite clinics and other things through MSKCC. How do you see these things trickling out into the community?
Right. So that is interesting. So MSK has sort of a hub and spoke model where we have a main campus in Manhattan, but we have a number of different satellite or regional care centers that are MSK run. Essentially, doctors or myeloma specialists even go out to these regional centers and they'll see the patients in the communities. And again, we don't want to necessarily have to bring every single patient into Manhattan to be able to deliver these cares, admit the therapies, and then admit them, so on and so forth. Patients are not able to travel into the city for logistical reasons. So essentially, this model allows us to go ahead and kind of create this system, this net, safety net, if you call it, where we're able to monitor these patients, deliver out the therapies out in the regional centers, out in the communities. From an actual, logistical standpoint, this means now we not only have to train, the nurses and the ERs within MSK main campus, that means now we have to do more training out in the regionals with our community partners, making sure that, for instance, tocilizumab is stocked in those facilities. And if a patient presents to a local ER, we have to have an algorithm or some sort of, system in place where those local ER doctors are able to manage the patients. So, again, it adds another layer of complexity. In the ASH protocol that, or the ASH abstract that Sri mentioned, she will be presenting data on how we were actually able to do this effectively. So several of our patients were actually able to go ahead and receive their bispecifics out in the community satellite centers and really not even have to step one foot into Manhattan, which is really kind of neat. So I think this is sort of, again, another way that this abstract is demonstrating that we can deliver these therapies out in the community safely.
That's wonderful. And it's those kind of things that really gives me the sort of hope that about the kind of truly increasing access to these treatments and democratizing it, because there are all the payer problems that we know about and we're not going to touch on here, but there is just also that there is limitations of geography. And so if you can overcome that, that's a wonderful thing. Shri, I guess to build on that slightly, when it sounds like you had to go through the whole education program again at these different clinics. Again, did you find that there were any particularly helpful or useful ways of keeping the physicians at these community clinics aligned with the protocols, the evidence? Was there anything that you did differently there, or was it the same as before, just bite-sized chunks and repetition? Oh, you're muted, my friend.
There you go. Okay, great. So I think as Neha mentioned, because we have this hub and spoke model, I can speak to the myeloma service. And again, within MSK, a lot of the physicians that are out in the regional sites are also on the main campus, but we also have a few physicians that are out there in the regional site that are not on main campus, but we are one myeloma service. We have our weekly meetings and we have our multiple different meetings during which this and many other projects are discussed ad nauseum, to speak. And so this is always on the top of people's minds. And we actually have patients who are being trained by nurses at the main campus who also have taken the lead in actually partnering with us as one of our lead nurse liaisons. And they have been very instrumental in training some of the new nurses that have joined in the regional sites. And so they, there are some constant folks as well as there are these new folks who are joining. So more than physicians, I feel it's the nursing service that has really stepped up and partnered with their counterparts in the regional sites, providing them the education. Some of them have even traveled to Manhattan to get more familiar with how the device is and then taken that to the regional sites. As far as physicians, we have Neha and I have presented to our group initially, and then in 6 months we have also presented, hey, this is what the data looks like. This is again a refresher of what the device is, etc. So our faculty meetings, we often talk about this. So again, repetition, it's on top of everyone's minds. Everyone knows how many more patients that we are planning to do, etc. So we have a buy-in from our colleagues as well, and then the nursing service really steps up and helps whichever patient that needs, whether it be on the main campus or the regional sites. And also the other layer of complexity that's there, almost all the devices are housed in our Manhattan campus. So as long as we have a 2-day notice, our offices also ship the device to the regional facility under the doctor's or the nurse's name so that it's ready, and then the nurses call in the patient, educate the patient, etc. So as Neha mentioned, we're able to do this without having the patient travel 40, 50 miles to Manhattan. We are able to do this all out in the regional sites.
I love that. And it's that idea that, they may be in a regional site, but they're still part of the team. And it's maintaining that idea that you are all one service, which I guess, not to be too much of a tech evangelist, but tech can help with.
Yes.
So, I mean, we're kind of drawing to the end of this. And I really want to thank you both for how clearly you've explained a complicated program. There are a couple of questions. One is an easy one from Charles Hall. Is the data reported in wearables integrated directly into Epic? Now, I'm not going to bring up Neha's Epic traumas because she was partly responsible for launching MSKCC. But yes, from a current health perspective, we are fully integrated into Epic. I don't know if we actually do that for you yet at MSKCC, though, Neha.
We don't, but we're looking forward to it at some point because we at least know that the capability is there.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so for Sarah Cannon, which is our large CAR T program where we've had about 600 patients through, that's all fully epicked. And from Sydney Quattrocchi, can you speak more to outpatient eligibility and if monitoring has helped expand that? I guess we've touched on some of those things, but if you'd like to summarize that, Neha, perhaps as you're unmuted, or go for it, Sri.
Yeah. Oh, Sri, maybe you want to just on the eligibility.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So, I had briefly touched upon the eligibility earlier before. Again, to summarize that, it's any patient who's getting bispecific antibody, we look whether, they have, ideally speaking, a caregiver that can be with them at most times. Again, we do not mandate that it's the same caregiver, just that there needs to be a caregiver support and that the caregiver is willing to be educated. We also expanded our requirement so that any patient who is living 90 minutes away from Manhattan, and if you think about it geographically, it can be within Manhattan itself, depending on the time of day and the type of day. Also, this can be anywhere in as much as 50 miles south or west or north in New Jersey, upstate New York, or deep into Long Island. All of this falls within, or Staten Island, Brooklyn, all of that. All of this falls within the 90-minute radius that we kept. And also, the patients need to be in a good performance status, meaning they're able to take care of themselves, do a lot of their work themselves. What we found was that keeping this 90-minute requirement has really helped us expand to patients. For example, there were 8 patients who we treated at the regional sites out of these 18 patients. And if I were to give you a range, the median distance every single patient treated at the regional was 20 miles away from Manhattan, and the range between 1 mile to 50.5 miles. So, the farthest patient away from the main center was 50 miles away. And they did not have to come in. They were treated at the regional site in New Jersey without the patient having to come in. So I think that these were patients who previously, if you can imagine, had to come in with the caregiver, be in Manhattan, be admitted for at least a week until they had the step-up dosing. But this was a patient who could be in the comforts of their home, wearing a device and just presenting 10 minutes away to their regional center and getting treatment.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you. So I would just like to thank you both, not just for coming on and delivering this webinar today, but for all the effort that you have put in to set up what is a very innovative program that is clearly making the lives of patients much easier. Not having to drive 55 miles into Manhattan sounds like the best thing that you could give somebody under those circumstances. So thank you both for your continued efforts, which are truly impressive. And I would encourage anyone in the audience to come and check out the full work at ASH in a couple of weeks. And hopefully we'll see you for the next one, whatever that may be.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.